Hello. All right. I hope y'all are doing well. This week we are discussing language and culture. So I thought to put together a little lecture video, discussing it. Um, so let me share my screen. Uh, this is not the one. This is the one. Okay. So before I get into it, you have an essay due this week, and then you have not a quiz, a discussion. No, you don't have discussion. You have an essay and Instagram post due this week. And for that essay, you will have a prompt. You have 5 hours to write it up. I wanted unlimited time, but it doesn't give me that option with the quizzes. And so that being said, you have 5 hours to write it up. You'll have the prompt ready to go for that essay. And I might even put the prompt in the description because what I want you to do with this essay is to kind of prepare for it and then take it and write it up um, within that time frame. Um, but you are essentially explaining how language and providing some examples of how language has been transmitted and kind of shifted and changed from culture to culture. And you can provide some examples of this, um, especially ones discussed in your textbook on this topic. So you have that essay, and then you have Instagram post, which for the Instagram post, now that I'm thinking of it, trying to remember what I'm having you do. It'll be in the description of the assignment for that Instagram post. Okay. Now I remember. So you are to go out and take photos of any writing that you're seeing, any scripts, any um, sort of calligraphy works here too. So any writing that you're seeing in the environment, um, take a picture of it and post it to Instagram, and kind of discuss how language shows up around us and how it does impact culture and what does that look like. Um, and and take some time to just discuss that on your Instagram post. But I'll stop talking about this. So, we are again discussing culture and language this week. First and foremost, language has to be defined. So language consists of the shared knowledge of sounds, words, meanings, grammatical rules that people use to send and receive complex messages. Language in this way is kind of unique and becomes very unique from culture to culture. So, language is the systematic and conventional use of sounds, or signs, or written symbols for the purpose of communication or self expression. In this way, we can kind of evolve language, we can shorten it, we can abbreviate certain words, and that kind of can define a later generation in many ways. Only humans have language in its fully developed form, which is a very important thing to note here, making us unique to other non-human animals. And what it means there is that humans have the capacity to attach context and definitions to language, the way that other non-human animals are unable to do. Anthropological linguistics is the study of how language is used in everyday life and how it is integrated into various cultures around the world. Anthropologists here are interested in language use, structure, change, and relations among language, society, and culture. And there are five properties that are mainly discussed by Charles Hockett, but there are 13 in total. And these 13 properties of language, or these five properties of language, are discreteness, productivity, arbitrariness, displacement, multimedia potential. Going through it, for example, multimedia potential here is the potential for language in a media format and what that exactly looks like. What I further mean by that is how things like memes become language and become part of a culture. And anthropologists and anthropological linguistics study that aspect and how we develop and how certain generations like Gen Z and the like develop slang and the like through online interaction and culture. So that's just one example of that. But language helps to convey certain messages, sometimes in a discrete manner, sometimes in a productive manner. And sometimes language is meant to hide information or showcase information. Sometimes language is meant to convey certain messages in either a manipulative way or a controlling way. And those are negative aspects of language as well. So discreteness here is so while speaking, people can combine units, sounds, and words according to conventional rules. Knowing a language means knowing both the units and the rules for combining them. Productivity here derives from the ability to put words together to create new sentences and communicate messages. Arbitrariness is the relationship between sound combinations that make up words and meanings to those words as arbitrary. And then displacement refers to our ability to talk about objects, people, things, and events that are remote to time and space. Displacement is something that is developed. Young babies have to develop and learn displacement. They learn that through learning the meaning of objects, learning what to call stuff, learning what things are, learning how to attach things to certain contexts in that way. And so some of this, like productivity, discreteness, arbitrariness, displacement, um, kind of can take time to develop, in other words. And we see certain elements of this slowly developing, especially among young children and the like. And then multimedia potential, meaning that linguistic messages can be transmitted through a variety of media, right? So, in learning a language, people master an enormous amount of information. And from this, we have grammar. Grammar refers to a shared knowledge among those who speak a language. This includes sounds, rules for combining sound sequences, meaning of these sequences, and constructing sentences. Grammatical knowledge is something that is unconscious. When you grow up in a certain culture and speak a language continuously over and over and over again, and you're learning that language, it becomes intuitive. It becomes something that we don't even consider or think about. It's automatic in that way that we correct ourselves automatically on something. Um, while other people who are learning a language for the first time, it takes time to learn those sequences. It takes time to learn the meaning of those sequences and constructing those sentences. Because for example, how sentences are constructed shifts and changes from culture to culture. And so, we might have, in one culture, we might have the subject of the sentence at the beginning of that sentence, versus another culture might have the subject at the end of that sentence or the middle of that sentence. And so, again, these sequences shift and change depending on the cultural rules of that particular language. Dialects are variations of a single language based upon factors of region, subculture, ethnic identity, and socioeconomic class. We develop dialects all over. regionally and universally. Here in the United States, we have particular dialects that can develop, right? So, the Texas dialect, the Southern dialect, the Midwestern dialect, right? Where you tend to see that particular speech pattern that emerges from city to city, region to region, and can even develop within certain racial and ethnic groups and classes. Anthropologists note that there are no superior dialects here in a linguistic sense. According to your textbook, that is, each language and each dialect is equally capable of serving as a vehicle for communicating the messages its speakers need to send to receive, in other words. So there's no superior dialect here because they all do what they are intended to do. They all convey a message that they are intended to convey. Sound, so part of this discussion of language includes sound systems. So phonology is the study of sounds and sound systems of a language. Phonemes are distinct sounds speakers of a language recognize. You might recognize phonemes because you most likely than not grew up doing it as a young child. So this includes consonants, vowels, and pitches, and how these are each specific to words and word sequences. So, for example, you have the e sound, which is a phoneme, the f sound, the r sound, that are all important to making certain words and speaking certain words, in other words. So, face, you need that to make that word and to enunciate it. Eat, you need that E sound. Race, again, you need that R sound to come out. And then you start to combine certain letters here. So Q, ch, sh, th are all important. And again, it takes time, for example, for children to develop these sounds. So the sound is important to enunciating the word catch, right? So you need the ch sound for catch. Or what's another word here? Should, right? You need that sh sound for should. And you need to enunciate it as such to combine those two particular letters here. As well as certain words like ear and air. It's very hard, especially in the English language, to distinguish between certain words because they sound so similar to one another. And so ear and air is a good example of this, that sometimes people whose language isn't their first language isn't English might struggle with words like this. Tone language is when words change meanings through the pitch and pronunciation. Some good examples of this is ba, high tone versus ba, mid tone, ba, low tone, right? So you have different tones to approaching these certain ba sound in certain languages. And those specific tones indicate a different meaning to that word or to that phrase. And so high tone ba is to be sour. Mid tone ba is to cut. Low tone ba is to count. Words further have meanings. And so we aren't just enunciating something to enunciate it, we're conveying a message. And so we attach meanings to specific words. And we further attach meanings to specific parts of words. So morphology is the system of combining units of meaning, words and parts of words. Any sequence of phonemes that carry meaning is called a morpheme. So these are un, pre, non, anti, ed, s, ing, ist, right? And we might, for example, put ed at the end of a word, um, or pre at the beginning of the word. For example, studied or ological is a good example of this. Sociological, anthropologist, sociologist, right? So that ending ist sound here that might show up. Or for the ing, um, you might have showing, running. It's an action, right? You're doing it, in other words. There are two types of morphemes here. You have the free morphemes and the bound morphemes. So free morphemes and bound morphemes are, for example, the aspects of desire and desires and desirable and undesirable. That becomes a bound morpheme, where you have free morphemes of the initial word, right? So the desire word and the addition to it of desirable, undesirable, and desires. Furthermore, certain combinations of words are okay, while other combinations are not. So, for example, John gave a book to the library. That doesn't make sense. Um, versus John gave the library a book. Makes a little bit more sense here. It sounds like a gift, but nonetheless, it makes a little bit more sense than the first one. John donated the library a book. Makes the most sense in this instance, right? For this particular sentence and what we're trying to explain John doing, right? He's donating a book to the library. Another example is Mary kissed John. Okay, John kissed Mary. The combination of words Mary Ed John kiss doesn't make sense at all. And so it's important to combine words effectively here and correctly. Getting further into this, into the history of how language has been developed, we have to look at Germanics, Romantics, and the native language. And so we tend to, especially with the English language, tends to draw from Germanic and Romantic and native language here, and how we label certain stuff and how we say certain stuff. So, English is part of the Germanic subfamily of languages. Dutch, German, Norwegian, Icelandic, Swedish, Danish, and Afrikaans. And that's where you're getting a lot of this language structure here. At one point in history, thousands of years ago, there were single language called the Proto-Germanic language. This is not the case anymore, because ever since then we've developed very, very unique dialects and language structures that we've kind of split off from this. And in part, that is due to people moving from region to region. And because they're moving from region to region, they're bringing their language with them. The spread of Latin through the Roman Empire created cognates. Cognates are words in different languages that have similar meanings, pronunciations, and spelling here. Terms for food and animal here in America derive from South American and Native American peoples. So piranha, jaguar, llama, yucca, mosquito or mesquite, pecan, hickory, and the like here are all terms that we derive from certain cultures to help us label certain things. And then I also have, I think it compares and contrasts English language to Spanish language here, and as well as going through the pronunciation. So academic, authentic, automatic, and how these are so similar to Spanish language here. Again, they're deriving from the Romantics, like the English language did. Non-verbal communication is another aspect of language here that is very important. And so, with the week on culture, I discussed gestures and facial structures and how they might mean a particular thing in a particular society and culture. So, facial expressions, body languages, gestures allow people to read other people. And when you grow up becoming accustomed to a particular facial expression or body language, you might misinterpret other people when they do a particular facial expression and body language. What I further mean by that is if you grew up um, in a culture that established that when you give a thumbs up, then it's a good thing and good job, right? That might be a culture that you're accustomed to. That might be a body language that you're accustomed to. But in other cultures, this thumbs up might mean that you're flipping someone off and might be like cursing at someone. And it might be that instance that what it means in your culture does not mean the same thing in another culture here. And the same thing applies to facial expressions and gestures and the like. Another good example of that would be in one culture, it might be standard to keep eye contact. Another culture, it might be considered rude to keep eye contact consistently. So there are part of so anger, sadness, happiness, boredom are all examples of how we might be expressing ourselves and what our emotional expression might look like. And this, again, might shift and change from culture to culture. But we tend to, cry when we are desiring to express something, a particular emotion, or when we are sad, right? We tend to be happy, and when we're happy, we tend to smile. And that's seen from culture to culture, from region to region. Proxemics is studies the meanings conveyed by space and distance between people, right? It really gets at the sort of going almost back to sociology here, but the symbolic sort of interplay between groups and how people communicate with each other without even talking to one another. That's very interesting. And how we interpret things through the aspect of certain gestures and shaking of hands and the like. Touching is another part of this discussion of nonverbal communication because it is culturally tied. Some cultures have particular ways of communicating through touch, like, for example, kissing one's cheek or touching the side of one's cheek with your lips, right? Or bowing or holding one's hand. And sometimes some intimate gestures, like kissing one's cheek or holding one's hand, isn't always romantic. It might be a form of a friendship bond, and that is culturally seen and specific to one culture, while it differs from another culture here. So it's important to note that. Language socialization is the process of getting socialized through language and the process of getting socialized to language. Um, Language socialization here is very important. It's very important for, in this case, young children to be properly socialized because part of socialization allows them to learn language within a society. If children aren't properly socialized with peers their age or with other people who speak a language, they won't learn how to speak that language. And so there are a multitude of studies, for example, looking at feral children who were raised in the wild or isolated from society and how they never developed a language at all. And the reason why they weren't able to develop a language is because They weren't socialized in a society. Thus, they were disconnected. They could not communicate. Um, and they were then isolated because of that. And those are a multitude. If you search up like feral children studies, you can find information on feral children because there's a multitude of studies that have been done on them. There is also power in language because going back to this, language helps to connect us to our culture. It helps us to socialize with other people and to learn from other people. Because of this, language is a powerful tool that is utilized. And it's utilized in effective ways. So, power in language highlights how language plays a crucial role in mediating differences in power between speakers. Power is something that can be highlighted within group dynamics and individual interests. So, in this way, people might lead a conversation in a group dynamic. And in that instance, they might have more say in that group dynamic than other people. And that is an instance of power and how power can be seen through language. Um, you also have awareness of speakers and being aware of particular speakers, mediating functions of ideologies and role of language and identity construction. Wonder if okay, I think I further explained these. So, sociolinguistics and social context includes enculturation. Provides children the Enculturation provides children the knowledge of how to conduct themselves in particular social contexts. Enculturation here is a very, very important process to children's developmental processes. Um, Furthermore, speech behavior is dependent on the role of the person and the relation to other people. Stated differently, we tend to talk differently around different groups of people. We tend to talk differently around our friends than around our family members and around our coworkers. We tend to say particular stuff and say particular jokes that we don't say with our bosses or coworkers and the like because it might be deemed as inappropriate. Because there are certain settings in what we say and what we do. Sociolinguistics study this type of behavior, and they study how speech behavior is impacted by social context, what we do in certain social contexts, and how that kind of predicts our behavior in many ways. So, going back to how language is power, by controlling discourse, what is talked about and how it is discussed in public arena, individuals and groups attempt to control opinions. This is in part discussed heavily, especially with sociolinguistics and by cultural anthropologists. This is further understanding how political speech works. And political speech is one example of how power might work within particular groups of people and between individuals, right? And this is the primary one that's discussed in your textbook. I have another example, but political speech here is instrumental. We know somewhat where a politician stands by the phrases they use. And you start to pick up on this because these words become buzzwords for politicians. And we know this well, for example, in the United States. And we can see this across many nations and how they talk about certain political views and approaches. And so, certain very certain things, like for example, abortion here, is talked about in a particular way. And how a politician talks about something like abortion really determines their particular stance on it. For example, if they say that abortion is murder, that kind of indicates how they feel about abortion versus whether or not they say abortion is the right to choose. Again, it's how language is being conveyed as a message in that particular instance. That's all that's very important to note here. And how that message is conveyed across groups of people. Because if you don't, let's say, for example, you disagree with abortion and consider it murder. If you're hearing someone say that it's a right to choose, that might affect how you are reacting to that person and how you interpret what they're saying. And you might, in fact, completely ignore them once you know their particular view or stance, in other words. And the same goes for if you consider abortion the right to choose, uh, you might disagree with a politician when they say that abortion is murder, right? And you might completely disagree and completely ignore them after that point because they've made their stance very clear through the language that they used or the buzzwords that they use. Same as considering immigrants and how we define immigrants. This is especially topical in the United States, how we either define them as illegal or undocumented workers, right? And so it's how you define certain things that become politically charged, like immigrants, like abortion. And that further, again, if you're hearing a politician say illegals, that kind of indicates to you their particular stance towards immigrants versus undocumented workers. So take a second and write in your reflection journals this question. So, why are such words, phrases, slogans, and the like so important to political campaigns? Do you have any examples of this? Can you write down any examples of this? Try to think about. So I gave two examples of this with abortion and immigration. Those are just one of two of many examples of buzzwords used by politicians. So take a second, think about it. What are some buzzwords that politicians could be using and what they have used historically speaking? And how they talk about certain, for example, certain populations, right? Because it is seen consistently, and it's an element of language here that is meant to display a message without actually saying the message outright. And that's how politicians speak. So, so take a second, reflect upon that question. Language is also a reflection. So, a semantic domain is a set of words that belongs to an inclusive class. Um, and so, for example, uh, the language that we use might be distinct to our class. So, meaning our upper class, middle class, lower class standing. And so we might not use words like, I don't know, China cabinet or Ottoman if we are lower class, or we might, right? It's also depending on region as well. And simply that's because subcultures like upper class, middle class, and lower class develop their own words within that. And so it can become particularly isolating, for example, when you're lower class or middle class and you're interacting with someone who is upper class, because they might be using certain words that you don't really understand, and you don't know what they're really talking about. Again, that's just what this is getting at. It's further getting at how certain languages have more diverse understandings of this. And so here, for example, English has not only the word chair, right? You could also say ottoman, but it doesn't really necessarily get at the aspect of chair, right? Are you talking about a rolling chair? Are you talking about a gaming chair, right? You have to be more specific here. Versus other languages have more diverse understandings of particular things, like snow and ice. And it goes beyond that into understanding what different types of snow looks like. Um, this is especially seen in the Alaskan region. You also see, for example, in French language, this is another good example. Love. There are a multitude of definitions of love. This is another good example of it. Where here in the English language, we just have love, and it kind of is that singular thing, love. Uh, in the French language and the Romantics, they consider love to be very diverse. I mean, there's not just there is parental love, there is agape love. I mean, there is a whole list of different types of love that the English language just does not get at. And it doesn't fully describe something like that. And the same is seen with snow and ice and the like here. And this is just getting at how sometimes we might not effectively describe stuff because our language might limit us in that capacity of explaining something, like love. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, very important theory here and hypothesis here. The most interesting theory about language and culture came from Benjamin Lee Whorf and Edward Sapir. This is their hypothesis. So it asks to what extent, if at all, does our language govern our thought processes? This is also known as the Whorfian Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Very a lot of Whorf going on. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis consists of two components, linguistic determinism and the linguistic relativity. And both of these are the expression of thoughts and cultural determinism of language. So, I have a quote here to further get at the Sapir and Whorf hypothesis. It revolves around the idea that language has power and control and how you see the world. Language is a guide to your reality, structuring your thoughts. It provides the framework through which you make sense of the world. And how you make sense of the world is sometimes through emotions and expressions of thought. Sapir-Whorf gets at this. So we exhibit certain expressions like happiness, sadness, and anger that further helps us navigate the world around us. And it helps us reflect upon what is occurring in that specific time and place. So, language expresses cultural reality. So, words help to express facts, feelings, and ideas. Again, this is all part of Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Words reflect attitudes, behaviors, and points of view. And so, with that, words help to express facts, feelings, and ideas. This further leads to certain attitudes and beliefs and points of view to develop from these particular feelings and ideas, right? Language embodies cultural reality. This is spoken, written, visual language that helps to keep communication between people. And this further helps to establish, which is a very important element to language, a sense of belonging. Because if you feel, if you are not tied to the language, you might not have a strong sense of belonging, right? Or you might feel disconnected. That's also what's discussed in the feral children research. Language also symbolizes cultural reality, which I already get at. Language is viewed as a symbol of social identity. And language in that is where you find your social identity. Who you are is oftentimes connected to the language that you speak and what you feel tied to. And it can make you feel like you really, really belong, or you don't really belong anymore because you lost that language along the way. And so, in that ways, language can be very, very crucial and how people connect with one another. So, an example of this is gender. Constructions of gender and language. This just simply looks at how languages are gendered in many ways. So we create word associations that pertain to the roles of men and women in society. In this, you even have languages that have feminine meanings and masculine meanings, and they switch between the both, and alternate between the both. This is seen with Spanish language. And then also perceptions of time and language. So how the tenses are structured in a language that may dictate how people perceive the concept of time here. And that's pretty much it for this lecture. It's very brief. I just go through very briefly the aspect of language here. So take some time, watch the videos that I posted in Canvas about language being culture and the like here because they're very, very good. They're both TED Talks, and I enjoy them very much. And so I'm going to stop share. All right. So I will talk to you later. Have a great day. Bye.